Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, The Empire State, the Qin Dynasty. For Chinese people in the year 221 BCE, there was good news and bad news. The good news was that the period now known as the Warring States was finally over. The bad news was that this chaotic time was brought to an end by a totalitarian power, the Qin Dynasty, that would rule over its unified kingdom with great brutality. Remember the time of the Warring States? People would soon be saying. Turns out it wasn't as bad as we thought. Or at least this is the impression conveyed by the earliest historians to inform us about the Qin. But given that these historians lived under the subsequent Han Dynasty and had every reason to paint the Qin rule as tyrannical, we should take their portrayal with a grain of salt. The same goes for a common, though rather simplistic, approach to Chinese history that sees it as nothing more than a struggle to maintain centralizing unity, constantly threatened by fragmentation. This approach is subtly encouraged by the very phrase warring states, with its implication that a multiplicity of states is a guarantee of constant warfare. It's also implied by the equally common presentation of Chinese history as a succession of dynasties, stretching back into the mists of time, Shang, Zhou, and now the Qin and the Han, followed later by other major dynasties, the Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing. But it's not as if one gave way to the other in an orderly and peaceful transition. There were periods of weakness at the center and of rule by multiple powers, for instance in the centuries following the collapse of the Han in 220 CE. Despite this, many general historical overviews imply that China, despite its enormous size and cultural diversity, is supposed to be unified under a single authority, with any departure from this being an aberration. The Qin can take a lot of responsibility for establishing that expectation. As they proclaimed in one of their inscriptions, they had unified all under heaven into one family, warfare will not arise again. After about 2.5 centuries of the Warring States period, though, unified imperial rule could not be taken for granted. Even the most optimistic could hardly have expected the nearly 4.5 centuries of such rule that would come under the Qin and the Han. It must be said that almost all of that era is taken up by the Han. From 206 BCE to 9 CE, we have the time of the Western Han, whose capital city was Chang'an, and then from 25 CE to 220 CE, the Eastern Han, based at Luoyang. By comparison, the previous Qin dynasty was a flash in the pan, lasting only about 15 years and featuring only 2 emperors. Their historical impact was enormous, though, despite their short reign. Most famously, they've significantly advanced the construction of what we now know as the Great Wall along their northern borders. Most infamously, they are said to have destroyed great quantities of books in 213 BCE under the notorious Chancellor Li Si. But that's already a good example of the somewhat unfair reputation suffered by the Qin. In fact, it seems that they only confiscated the books and placed them in a central repository, which was then destroyed when the dynasty fell. Any idea that they were adamantly opposed to literary pursuits should be dispelled by the fact that they also introduced a new script for writing with ink and brush, which was more fluid and thus quicker to use. That's typical of the Qin, whose most characteristic trait, for better and worse, was a relentless commitment to standardization in the name of efficiency. Their program of optimization went back at least as far as the early so-called legalist Shang Yang in the middle of the 4th century BCE. As we learned last time, he put his ideas into practice by introducing many reforms that set a template for later Qin policies. Among the many social phenomena they sought to control were currency, weights and measures, criminal law, ranks of honor, and division of the land. That land was expected to produce a certain yield per unit, and humans were expected to be productive too. Thus, officials were held to fixed expectations, messengers were monitored to make sure they covered a certain distance each day. The Qin even introduced passports for traveling through their territory, and insisted that goods at market should be labeled with price tags, the better to collect taxes on each transaction. As one scholar has commented, the aim of the Qin Empire was to allow the state to make society legible so that it could be efficiently recorded, monitored, controlled, and utilized by the state. This makes the Qin government sound like relentlessly pedantic bureaucrats, yet the other powers of the Warring States period considered them barbaric, because they originally came from the western fringes of the Chinese world. Most later historians write about the Qin as if they continued to be barbarians. Early on during the Han period, a scholar named Jia Yi wrote a work called Faulting the Qin, which helped to shape subsequent assessments of the dynasty. Jia Yi traced their military success to geographical advantages, being protected by living in a mountainous region and hardened for battle by their unforgiving territory. Once the Qin invaded the rival states, they showed themselves unworthy to exercise unchallenged rule by failing to exercise benevolence and righteousness. Note the use of Confucian terminology there. In Jia Yi's negative portrayal, which was echoed by Sima Tian, the Qin failed primarily because of their moral depravity. Their cruelty was bound to provoke uprisings sooner or later, and it turned out to be sooner, with the regime toppled after only a brief reign. This explanation is not implausible. The Qin made extensive use of coerced labor, forcing many thousands of convicts, slaves, and peasants to build enormous structures like palaces, mausoleums, and of course, the Great Wall. The surveillance they inflicted on the people was inevitably far less effective than would be possible nowadays with modern technology, but it still must have been vexing, to put it mildly, when the Qin imposed their policy of mutual implication, whereby neighbors were expected to inform on one another and punished for one another's crimes if they did not. To make things even worse, it was a crime to bring false accusations, so every time anyone was accused, someone was going to be found guilty, either the suspected criminal or the witness who brought the charge. This and other strict legal policies are not unrelated to the point about forced labor. A steady supply of convicted criminals was needed to work on all those ambitious construction projects. It would be nice to think that wicked leaders will inevitably fail politically, as Jia Yi and Sima Tian piously assumed. But as we know from our own experience, there's no guarantee of that. So other, less moralizing hypotheses have been put forward for the abrupt fall of the Qin. The ambitious campaign of construction certainly involved cruelty, but it was also ruinously expensive. The dynasty seems to have overreached in its military ambitions as well as in financial outlay. One could therefore argue that the Qin failed because they were too ambitious, not because they were too harsh. But as authors living under the Han and steeped in the political theories of Confucianism, Jia Yi and Sima Tian naturally preferred to explain the fall of the Qin in moral terms. In so doing, they were holding the Qin dynasty to the standards of its own propaganda. Like the Zhou dynasty before them, the Qin claimed to have the mandate of heaven. Our historians were quick to argue that the Qin did not deserve that mandate, so as to suggest that the Han were more worthy to rule. In the case of Sima Tian, though, the situation may be more complicated still. He was surely no admirer of the Qin, but a study by Hans von Ess, a colleague of mine here at the LMU in Munich, argues that Sima Tian's account of the first Qin emperor also served as an indirect commentary on the politics of his own day. With his stories of book-burning, cruelty towards scholars, and merciless treatment of the people, Sima Tian was diplomatically, but none too subtly, issuing a warning. Don't act like this or you will be overthrown, just like the Qin were. Fortunately, we're not entirely dependent on the biased historians of the Han period. Over the past half-century or so, a number of archaeological discoveries have greatly increased scholarly understanding of the Qin, for the centuries leading up to their unified rule and during their brief time at the top. These include treasure troves of written material, which, appropriately to a political power reputedly shaped by legalist thought, are especially rich in legal documents. Alongside texts about the law, there are mathematical, medical, and military treatises, as well as books about self-improvement for men of the official class. These documents have been uncovered in the graves of officials and scribes. In all likelihood, they were preserved not for archival reasons, but because they displayed successful administration and record-keeping of which the deceased could be proud. From a philosophical point of view, the writings are valuable because they show how the ideas of men like Shang Yang and Han Feizi were being put into practice. For instance, they provide information about investigation of criminal cases. The bad reputation of the Qin would lead us to expect that they found pretty well all suspects guilty and sent them off to build the Great Wall or some other monument. But in fact, the documents recommend rational procedures for getting to the truth of the matter. For instance, there was a rule against using physical violence against witnesses, since this was deemed likely to produce false testimony. Higher up in the social hierarchy, the Qin rulers were surprisingly keen to present themselves as moral paragons, as if they were consulting the Analects alongside the works of the legalists. A number of surviving inscriptions show how the two Qin emperors wanted their rule to be perceived, if not how they themselves understood that rule. Of course, they were proud of having achieved unchallenged political dominance. One inscription boasts, "Wherever human traces reach, there is none who does not declare himself the emperor's subject. His favor extends to oxen and horses." But the first emperor also declared himself to be like a sage, with the virtues of benevolence and righteousness, these being exactly the traits that our historian Jia Yi found sorely lacking. And if you look hard enough, you can find the Qin embracing values reminiscent of Confucianism. Remember the passage from the Analects about upright Gong, whom Kongzi criticized for accusing his father of a crime? Well, the Qin made it impossible for sons to denounce their fathers, and crimes committed against parents were automatic grounds for enslavement. But this was not because the legalists believed that filial piety was an important virtue. Rather, they subscribed to the force of parental authority alongside other forms of authority. A father could use this system of law to deliver punishments to members of his family, even banishing or executing them. Further evidence comes from those books for officials on self-cultivation. These are not just manuals of bureaucratic efficiency and rigor. To the contrary, a Qin period text called simply How to Be a Good Official stresses that moral integrity and caution are the secrets to success. The Qin adherence to traditional, if not strictly Confucian, values goes back to the pre-imperial times of the Warring States period. Here's an irony worth enjoying. It would seem that in this era, Qin was the only state that carried on certain ritual practices from the time of the Zhou, the very rituals that the Confucians wanted to restore. More generally, the Qin saw themselves as the rightful inheritors of the Zhou legacy. One dramatic illustration was their use of the so-called five-phase theory, Wu Xing, which postulates a natural change along a standard cycle of wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Dynastic change was correlated to phase change, so overthrow of the outgoing power could be justified as just one more natural transformation. The philosophical theory of the five phases already began to emerge in the Warring States period, but it was under the Qin that it was first used for the purpose of political legitimacy. The Qin associated themselves with the element of water because the Zhou dynasty was linked to fire, and sometimes in dynastic sequences, fire and water are placed in close succession because they represent opposing cosmic forces. The Qin duly adopted black as their imperial color, this being the color associated with water. One might infer that the cycle would continue, meaning that the Qin were destined to fall once the next natural transformation came along. But by choosing water, they were identifying themselves with the end of the cycle. Perhaps then they sought to convey the idea of a permanent rule, an end to political transformation, even if that's not how things worked out. The Qin's attempt to connect their rule to that of the Zhou doesn't seem particularly legalist. Remember, Han Feizi and his predecessors were dismissive of the appeal to tradition shown by the Confucians. A ruler should not imitate the past, but do whatever will work in the here and now. And that is an attitude we can also see at work in Qin governance. They spoke of the cleansing of customs and carried this out in practice. Thus, the Qin allowed for much greater social mobility than had been the norm, using their system of ranked honors, with no fewer than 17 degrees, to promote men for military exploits and other successes. The highest honor, the one borne by the emperor, was the title Huangdi, a reference to the mythical Yellow Emperor. This supplanted the earlier title we've mentioned several times, Son of Heaven. As this suggests, despite that talk of the mandate of heaven, the Qin de-emphasized the role of Tian, or heaven, in their propaganda, perhaps in order to give themselves credit instead. But of course, the best example of the Qin's lack of reverence for historical tradition was their destruction, or at least confiscation, of Confucian books and other literature. In Sima Qian's account, which is again not to be taken at face value, we read that the Qin coupled this measure with a terrifying threat. Those who use the ancient system to criticize the present will be executed together with their families. It's for good reason that Yuri Pines, an expert on both legalist thought and the Qin, has written that no regime in China's long history prior to the Communist Revolution was so consciously derisive of the past, which was rendered infinitely inferior to the present. As we move into the text produced around the Qin dynasty, we get a better glimpse into the writings of the period. Fairly or unfairly, legalist philosophy has a reputation that is closely intertwined with socio-political affairs and the lives of people under Qin rule. Even if the histories written during this time and after are not totally reliable, these and other writings, as well as archaeological finds, such as famously the terracotta warriors, can give us a sense of what life was like then. We need to read the literature of the time in quite a different way than writings from the Warring States period. Given the long and complex process that gave us the Analects, for example, we can't read that as a report on what was actually happening in 5th or 4th century BCE China. By contrast, the ideas of Xiangyang were actually put into practice by Lord Xiao of the Qin state, whose descendant was the infamous first emperor Qin Shi Huang. However, because of the disgrace of the Qin dynasty articulated in the Han dynasty, and for centuries after, scholars refrain from engaging with Xiangyang's views. The Qin rulers' willingness to depart from traditional norms is among the strongest signs that the legalist thinkers did influence them. It's also won them some admiration in modern times. The early 20th century thinker Hu Xi wrote in 1930, "Political dictatorship is surely frightening, but the dictatorship of adoring the past is even more frightening." That admiration was a long time in coming, given the polemical presentation of the Qin that developed under the Han and was generally accepted by later historians. Despite these polemics, the Han did not represent nearly so clean a break with the Qin as they wanted everyone to believe. At both the symbolic and pragmatic levels, they retained many features of Qin rule. As far as symbolism goes, five-phase theory was still part of imperial propaganda, and the Han emperor called himself Huang Di. And when it came to practical affairs, the Han coupled laments about the brutality of their predecessors with brutality of their own. The historian Mark Edward Lewis has written, "Although Han writers insisted on the disastrous consequences of Qin's excessively detailed regulations and cruel punishments, the records from their own period do not suggest that the Han made any significant improvement in these areas." Whether they did any better in philosophical terms is something we'll have to consider as we go along. But we're not ready to tackle the Han period yet, because there's still so much to say about the so-called legalists, or Fa thinkers. Having used this episode to lay out the historical context in which Han Feizi and the other legalist thinkers worked, we'll return to their writings next time by looking at their ideas about political power and authority. Like a boxer bested by an opponent, we've now taken it on the Qin, but we'll bounce back for the next round of The History of Philosophy in China.